No one in the conference room expected the voice to come from a child. Definitely not when a billionaire was red-faced with frustration, his Dutch investors threatening to walk out, and every executive in the room pretending not to panic while drowning in their own incompetence. Papers lay scattered across the mahogany table like debris from a shipwreck. The professional translator kept flipping pages, sweating through his expensive shirt, stuttering over words he should have known. Every second that ticked by on the crystal clock felt like money burning, like opportunity slipping through careless fingers. Richard Vanderberg had been trying for 15 agonizing minutes to fix what should have been a simple misunderstanding. In the contract, a single technical phrase was getting lost somewhere between English and Dutch, and with each fumbled attempt at clarification, the Dutch investment team grew noticeably colder. One man, gray-haired and stern-faced, even closed his leather folder with a definitive snap, checking his watch as if calculating how quickly he could reach the airport. Vanderberg's voice rose again, frustration bleeding through his usual composure. His assistant, Maria's mother Carmen, who'd been pulled in as a backup interpreter despite having only conversational Dutch, stumbled over another technical term. Her hands shook slightly as she turned pages in the contract. The mood in the room didn't just shift. It cracked like ice on a warming lake. And in the corner, barely visible behind a potted plant and a stack of unused chairs, sat 12-year-old Maria Santos. She'd been there for over an hour, doing her homework on her tablet, earbuds dangling around her neck. She hadn't planned to be there. No child plans to spend their Saturday in a corporate conference room that smells like leather and anxiety. But her mother's regular babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and Carmen couldn't afford to miss this meeting. Vanderberg had made that crystal clear. So Maria came, quiet and noticed, invisible in the way that black and brown children often learn to be in spaces that weren't designed for them. She'd been listening, though, even while working on her math problems, even while sketching in the margins of her notebook. She'd been listening to every word. The English, the Dutch, the growing frustration, the misunderstanding that was so obvious to her but somehow escaped everyone in their expensive suits. Maria had learned Dutch from her grandparents, immigrants who'd moved from Suriname to the United States when her mother was just a baby. They'd raised her onto languages, switching between them as naturally as breathing. Dutch wasn't just vocabulary to her. It was bedtime stories and birthday songs, grocery lists and gentle corrections, the sound of home. But in this room, she was just the help's daughter, a child who should be grateful to even be in the building. She watched her mother struggle, saw the color drain from Carmen's brown face as the investors grew more impatient. She saw Vanderberg's jaw tighten with each failed explanation. She felt the moment stretching thinner and thinner, ready to snap. And she made a choice. Then a calm, clear, young voice cut right through the chaos like a knife through fog. "Excuse me, sir. I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I think there's been a misunderstanding in the translation." Everything stopped. Every head turned. Every conversation died mid-sentence. The Dutch investors looked confused, then almost offended. Who was this child? And why was she speaking? Vanderberg's face went from red to white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Carmen's eyes went wide with something between pride and absolute terror. She reached out slightly, as if to pull her daughter back, to make her invisible again, to keep her safe in the corner where children belong. But Maria had already stepped forward. She was small for 12, with thick dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a hoodie because she hadn't known she'd end up at a business meeting. Her sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished floor. Everything about her screamed that she didn't belong in this space of power suits and corporate authority. Everything except her voice. The phrase in question, section 4.2 of the proposed agreement, she said, looking directly at the lead Dutch investor, speaking in flawless, accent-perfect Dutch, has been translated as guaranteed returns. But I believe the English version actually means projected returns based on current market analysis. The distinction matters because Dutch contract law treats guaranteed returns as a binding promise, while the English understanding is more flexible. That's why you're concerned about liability, and why Mr. Vanderberg is confused about your hesitation. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the air conditioning humming. The lead Dutch investor, Mr. de Vries, set down his pen slowly. He leaned forward, studying this child who had just explained in 30 seconds what an entire room of adults had failed to clarify in 20 minutes. "How old Benji?" he asked quietly. "How old are you, 12? Maria replied without hesitation. 12. En waar heb je Nederlands geleerd? Where did you learn Dutch? Van mijn grootouders. Die komen uit Paramaribo. From my grandparents. They're from Paramaribo." Something shifted in De Vries's expression. Suriname, the former Dutch colony. The complicated history between their countries suddenly present in the room like an uninvited guest. He nodded slowly, then looked at his colleagues. They exchanged words in rapid Dutch. Words that Maria heard clearly, but the others in the room could only guess at. She caught fragments correct. Exactly right. Why didn't someone say this earlier? Then De Vries spoke, this time in English, though his eyes never left Maria. "The child is absolutely correct. The translation has created a legal impossibility. No wonder we couldn't agree." Chairs that had been pushed back in preparation to leave suddenly eased forward again. Tempers cooled like tea forgotten on a table. Pens that had been kept reopened. Folders that had been closed spread open again. The entire negotiation shifted its center of gravity because a 12-year-old black girl had spoken up. But she wasn't finished. Vanderberg stared at her, his face cycling through embarrassment, relief, and something else, something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "You speak Dutch?" he finally asked, as if the previous 2 minutes hadn't just happened. Maria met his eyes without flinching. "Yes, sir." Fluently. "And you've been sitting here the entire time?" "Yes, sir. My mother couldn't find childcare on short notice. I hope my presence hasn't been disruptive." Her voice was polite. But there was something underneath it. Something that said, "I've been here the whole time, and none of you saw me." Vanderberg glanced at Carmen, who stood frozen by the presentation screen, her face a mixture of emotions too complex to name. Pride, fear, vindication, worry about what this might mean for her job. "Why didn't you speak up sooner?" Vanderberg asked. And there was something in his tone. Not quite accusation, but close enough. Maria tilted her head slightly, and for a moment, she looked much older than 12. "I'm a child, sir." I wasn't sure if it was my place to correct the adults in the room. Let that sink in. -1-year-old child had sat in that corner, watching educated professionals fail at their jobs, watching money and opportunity drain away, watching her own mother struggle and stress. And she'd stayed silent because she'd already learned what so many black and brown children learn too early, that speaking up often costs more than staying quiet, that being right doesn't protect you if you're the wrong age, the wrong color, the wrong kind of person to have knowledge in a room full of people who think knowledge belongs only to them. The implications hung in the air like smoke. One of the executives, a woman named Patricia who'd been silent for most of the meeting, cleared her throat. "Well, thank goodness she finally did speak up. Saved us all a lot of trouble." Her tone was bright, dismissive, ready to move past the uncomfortable moment. But De Vries wasn't ready to move on. He looked at Maria with an expression that was hard to read. "You understood the entire discussion, all the technical terms, the contract language, most of it?" "Yes, sir," Maria replied. "There were a few financial terms I'm not familiar with, but the core dispute was clear after the first few minutes." "The first few minutes," De Vries repeated slowly. He looked at the professional translator, who was now staring at his shoes. He looked at Vanderberg. He looked at all these highly paid professionals who had failed to do what a 12-year-old managed effortlessly. And perhaps he saw something in that failure that bothered him. Or perhaps he just saw a smart child who'd been ignored. Either way, he made a decision. "Young lady, would you be willing to help ensure the rest of this contract is translated correctly? I'll pay you consultant's rate, $200 an hour." The room gasped. Carmen gasped. Maria just blinked. "I'm 12, sir. I don't think I can legally enter a consulting contract." De Vries smiled for the first time that day. "Then we'll pay your mother, and she can pay you whatever allowance she deems appropriate. But I want you in this room, checking every page. Clearly, we need someone who actually understands both languages." It was a moment that could have been triumph, should have been triumph. But Maria saw her mother's face, saw the other executives exchanging looks, and she understood something that maybe DeVries didn't. Or maybe something he understood perfectly well and didn't care about. She was being given opportunity, yes. But she was also being used to embarrass the adults in the room, to prove a point. And her mother, whose job depended on these people's goodwill, was now tied to whatever came next. Asterisk, the rest of the meeting took 2 more hours. Maria sat at the actual table this time. Her homework pushed aside, the contract in front of her. She checked translations, caught 3 more significant errors, and helped clarify 2 ambiguous clauses. She was professional, careful, and precise, and she felt every eye on her like a weight. When you're invisible, you're safe. When you're visible, you're vulnerable. The executives who'd ignored her for an hour now watched her every move. Some with curiosity, some with resentment, some with an uncomfortable mixture of both. Patricia kept making comments. Well, aren't you clever? Such a bright young thing. Your mother must be so proud. Each compliment edged with something that didn't feel quite like praise. The professional translator packed up his things early and left without saying goodbye to anyone. His embarrassment was palpable. His career possibly damaged because a black child had done his job better than he could. Carmen stood in the corner, trying to be helpful, trying to be invisible again, trying to figure out how this would all play out on Monday morning when the executives had time to think about what had happened. Would they see her as the woman with the brilliant daughter, or as the woman who'd brought a child to a professional meeting and allowed her to show them all up? In America, in corporate spaces, in places where power and money and whiteness intersect, competence from unexpected sources often creates more problems than it solves. But Maria kept working, because that's what she'd been raised to do. Head down, work hard, be twice as good for half the recognition, prove yourself again and again, knowing the proof will never quite be enough. When the meeting finally concluded, contracts signed and hands shaken, the Dutch investors left with smiles and promises of future collaboration. DeVries paused at the door, turned back to Maria, and said in Dutch, "You have a gift, young lady. Don't let anyone tell you to keep it hidden." Maria replied in Dutch, "Thank you, sir. But sometimes hiding is how you survive." He paused, really hearing her for the first time, seeing perhaps what she'd been trying to tell him all along. Then he nodded slowly and left. Asterisk, when the room finally emptied, it was just Maria, Carmen, and Richard Vanderberg. The billionaire stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Finally, he turned. "That was remarkable, Maria. Truly remarkable. Thank you, sir. I'd like to arrange for you to work with us regularly. Translation services, document review. We have international contracts all the time. Your skills could be invaluable." Carmen tensed. Maria could feel her mother's anxiety radiating across the room. "That's very generous, Mr. Vanderberg," Maria said carefully. "But I'm in 7th grade. I have school and homework and soccer practice. I'm not sure I have time for regular work. We could work around your schedule, pay you very well. Think of it as an investment in your future." There it was. The offer that sounds like opportunity but might be something else. The golden handcuffs, the debt of gratitude, the expectation that now that they discovered her, she owed them her talent, her time, her language, her skills. "Mr. Vanderberg," Carmen finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" He looked surprised but nodded. "Maria, would you wait outside, please?" Maria gathered her things and left, closing the door behind her. She stood in the hallway, her heart pounding, wondering if her mother was about to lose her job, wondering if saving the deal had actually cost them everything. Through the closed door, she couldn't hear exact words, but she heard her mother's voice, rising and falling with emotion. She heard Vanderberg's deeper tones, interrupting, then falling silent. She heard her mother say something sharp, something that made the silence that followed feel dangerous. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Carmen came out, her eyes slightly red but her shoulders straight. Vanderberg followed, looking chastened in a way that probably didn't happen often. "Maria," her mother said, taking her hand. "We're leaving now. Mr. Vanderberg understands that you're a child, not an employee, and that what happened today was a one-time situation born of necessity. I apologize if I made you uncomfortable, Maria Vanderberg said, and he actually sounded sincere. Your mother has helped me understand some things about today that I hadn't fully considered. The position I put both of you in, the assumptions I made, the way I responded to the situation. Maria looked between them, trying to understand what had been said in that room. Carmen squeezed her daughter's hand. Mr. Vanderberg has agreed to pay you for today's consulting work, 3 hours, at $200 an hour, $600. But there are no expectations beyond that. No obligations, no debt. And, Vanderberg added, I've agreed to arrange language training for our professional staff so that we're not dependent on the random presence of talented 12-year-olds to conduct international business, he said, it with a slight smile. But there was something serious underneath it, an acknowledgement of failure. Thank you, sir, Maria said, and she meant it. Though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. As they walked to the elevator, Carmen pulled her daughter close. In the empty hallway, away from watching eyes, she finally let out the breath she'd been holding for hours. Mama, what did you say to him? Maria asked quietly. Carmen pushed the elevator button, then looked at her daughter. Really looked at her. This child who was brilliant and careful and already learning how to make herself small to fit into spaces that resented her presence. I told him the truth, Carmen said. I told him that you're not a tool to be used when convenient and ignored when not. I told him that what happened today put us both in an impossible position. I told him that he made assumptions about who belongs in that room and who doesn't. About who has knowledge and who doesn't. About whose voice matters and whose doesn't. The elevator arrived. They stepped in. And I told him, Carmen continued, that if he ever puts you in a position like that again, where you have to choose between staying invisible and speaking up, where you have to rescue adults who should know better, where your competence becomes everyone else's embarrassment, I will quit on the spot and make sure everyone knows why. Maria's eyes widened. Mama, you could lose your job. Baby, there are things more important than keeping a job. Your dignity is one of them. Your childhood is one of them. Your right to be a child. Making mistakes and learning without the weight of everyone's expectations and resentments on your shoulders, that's definitely one of them. The elevator descended in silence. I'm proud of what you did today, Carmen said finally. You were brave and brilliant and kind, but I never want you to feel like you have to fix adults' problems at the cost of your own peace. You understand? Maria nodded, feeling something release in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. That evening, over dinner at their small apartment, Maria told the story to her grandparents via video call. Her Oma and Opa listened, their faces showing pride and concern in equal measure. You did well, Kleintje, her grandfather said in Dutch. But remember, intelligence is not always welcomed, especially when it comes from unexpected places. Papa, don't discourage her, Maria's grandmother chided, but gently. I'm not discouraging. I'm preparing. He looked at Maria through the screen. Your Oma and I. We came to this country with education, with skills, with language, but we learned quickly that knowledge is only valued when it comes from the right kind of person. We were Dutch citizens, but we were also brown. We spoke the language perfectly, but people heard our accents and our skin spoke louder than our words. It's better now, Maria's mother said, but she didn't sound convinced. It's different now. Her grandfather corrected, not always better, just different. Today, Maria was useful. She solved a problem. But next week, next month, next year, will she be valued? Or will she be a reminder that a 12-year-old black girl outperformed a room full of expensive professionals? The question hung in there like smoke. Maria pushed her ricer on her plate. I just wanted to help Mama. I didn't think about all the other stuff. That's because you're 12, her grandmother said warmly. You shouldn't have to think about all the other stuff. But the world being what it is, you'll learn. We all learn. Later that night, lying in bed, Maria thought about the day. About the moment she decided to speak up. About the looks on people's faces when a child corrected them. About her mother's fierce protection. About her grandfather's warning disguised as wisdom. She thought about being invisible in that corner. and how comfortable invisibility had felt even though it hurt. She thought about the weight of visibility, how every eye on her had felt like judgment waiting to happen, and she thought about the Dutch investors, and whether they saw her as a clever child or as an anomaly, exception that proved the rule, a token of potential that would never be fully trusted or welcomed. She didn't have answers. At 12, she wasn't supposed to need them yet, but she was learning. Monday morning came too quickly. Carmen walked into Vanderberg's office building with her shoulders squared, ready for whatever consequences would follow Saturday's events. She'd spent Sunday updating her resume, just in case, but the day unfolded strangely. Vanderberg called her into his office first thing. She expected a lecture. Maybe a termination dressed up in corporate language about restructuring or finding better fits. Instead, he handed her an envelope. "Your daughter's consulting fee," he said, "plus a bonus for you. Hazard pay for bringing your child to work and having her save us all from our own incompetence." Carmen took the envelope, suspicious. "Mr. Vanderberg, if this is severance, it's not." "Carmen, I spent all day yesterday thinking about what you said. About assumptions and opportunity and whose voice gets heard in rooms like the one on Saturday. I'd like to say I'm not that kind of person, but clearly, I am. I'm trying not to be." He pulled out a folder. "I'm establishing a scholarship program for children of employees focused on language skills and international relations. Your daughter inspired it. I'd like you to help me develop it. And I'd like Maria to be the first recipient, if she's interested." Carmen stared at the folder, then at him. "Mr. Vanderberg, I appreciate the gesture, but my daughter doesn't need to be your diversity showcase. She's not a symbol to make your company look good." "I know," he said, and he seemed to mean it. "That's why I'm asking you to develop the program, to make sure it's real, to make sure it actually helps kids who need help, not just the ones who make us look good, to make sure it doesn't become another performative gesture that makes us feel better about our failures." Carmen sat down slowly. "Why?" "Because your daughter was right, and I was wrong. Because she sat in a corner for an hour, invisible to everyone including me. And I pay attention to things like this for a living. Because if we missed her talent that completely, how many others are we missing?" And because when she finally spoke up, my first thought wasn't gratitude. It was discomfort that a child had made us all look foolish. He paused, looking older suddenly. "Tired. I've spent 30 years building this company. I tell myself I built it on merit, on hard work, on recognizing talent. But Saturday showed me I've built it on assumptions about who has talent and where to look for it. Your daughter demolished those assumptions in about 30 seconds. Carmen studied him, looking for the trap, the catch, the hidden cost. But all she saw was a man genuinely unsettled by his own blindness. "I'll think about the scholarship program," she said finally. "But Maria's participation is her choice, and the program has to be real. Not a tax write-off with her name on it." "Agreed." That evening, Carmen sat down with Maria to tell her about the scholarship offer. They talked through dinner, through dessert, through the hours when homework should have been happening but life was happening instead. "What do you think, baby?" Carmen asked. "It's your choice." No pressure. Maria was quiet for a long time, processing. At 12, she was being asked to make adult decisions about opportunity and principle, about accepting help that came from complicated places. Will other kids actually benefit? She finally asked. Or is this just about me? That's what I'd be working on, making sure it's real. Will people say I only got opportunities because of what happened Saturday? That I'm a diversity case? Carmen's heart broke a little. Some people will say that no matter what you achieve, that's their problem, not yours. But it becomes my problem when they don't take me seriously, when they think I didn't earn things. Yes, Carmen agreed, because lying to her daughter had never been her way. It does become your problem. That's not fair, but it's real. Maria played with the edge of her napkin. Opa says intelligence isn't always welcomed from unexpected places. Your grandfather is wise, and sad, and right. So what do I do? Carmen reached across the table and took her daughter's hands. You make the choice that lets you sleep at night. You don't carry the weight of representing everyone who looks like you. You don't have to be perfect to prove you deserve space. You don't have to be twice as good for half the recognition, even though the world will often demand that. You get to just be Maria. Smart, talented, sometimes brave, sometimes scared, always learning. That's a lot of choices, Mama. I know, baby. I know, in the end. Maria said yes to the scholarship program, with conditions. She wanted to help interview other candidates. She wanted to make sure the program served kids who actually needed it, not just high achievers who already had plenty of support. She wanted it to include not just language skills but cultural competency, understanding that speaking multiple languages meant navigating multiple worlds. And she wanted Vanderburg to fund translation services for the company so she'd never again be in a position where adults failed at their jobs and looked to a child to fix it. Vanderburg agreed to everything. 5 years later, Maria Santos stood in another conference room, this one at Georgetown University, where she was finishing her freshman year with a double major in international relations and linguistics. She was 17 now, having graduated high school early. The Vanderburg Scholarship had paid for college, prep courses, set tutoring, and application fees. It had funded language immersion programs in 3 countries. It had opened doors that might have stayed closed. But more importantly, it had funded the same opportunities for 47 other students over those 5 years. Kids from immigrant families, kids who spoke 3 languages at home but were tracked into remedial English at school, kids whose knowledge was invisible until someone finally chose to see it. Maria had helped interview every single one of them. She was presenting her research today, a project about language accessibility and international development. The room was full of professors, graduate students, and professionals from various NGOs and government agencies. And in the back row, almost invisible behind a laptop and a stack of folders, sat a young boy, maybe 13, brown skin, careful eyes, doing homework while his mother, one of the event coordinators, worked. Maria saw him immediately, recognized something in the way he tried to take up as little space as possible. The way he listened even while appearing not to. Halfway through her presentation, she stumbled over a statistical term, not badly, but enough that she paused to clarify. A quiet voice from the back said, "Excuse me, I think the correct term is standard deviation from mean, not deviation from standard mean." Everyone turned. The boy shrank back, realizing he'd spoken aloud. Maria smiled, a real smile, warm and knowing. "You're absolutely right. Thank you for the correction." She made eye contact with him across the room, saw him see that she saw him, that he wasn't invisible to her, even if he was too. Everyone else thought after the presentation, after the polite applause and the professor's questions and the networking that felt like performance, Maria found the boy still in the back row, packing up his things. "Hey," she said. "That was a smart catch earlier." He ducked his head. "Sorry for interrupting." "Don't be. You were right. And I was wrong." "That's worth interrupting for." She sat down next to him. "What's your name, David?" "Hi, David. I'm Maria. And I have a story to tell you about another kid who corrected adults in a room where he wasn't supposed to speak up." His eyes widened slightly. "Really, really? And I want to tell you something important. Your intelligence isn't a burden. Your knowledge isn't something to apologize for. And you don't have to wait for permission to use your voice, even though people will try to teach you that you do." She pulled out a card, wrote something on the back. "This is information about a scholarship program for kids like us, kids who speak multiple languages, who see things others miss, who understand that being smart and being careful aren't the same as being silent." David took the card, held it like it was precious. "Are you going to tell my mom I interrupted your presentation?" "I'm going to tell your mom that you contributed meaningfully to an academic discussion and should be encouraged to do so more often." Maria stood up. "And David, next time, don't wait so long to save us." He smiled, small and tentative, and she saw her 12-year-old self reflected back at her. This story isn't just about a smart kid who saved a business deal. It's about visibility and invisibility, about who gets seen and who gets overlooked, about whose knowledge counts and whose doesn't, about how racism and bias don't always look like hatred. Sometimes they just look like assumptions about where intelligence lives and what faces it wears. Maria's story is repeated thousands of times a day across America. The brilliant black student whose contributions are dismissed until a white peer says the same thing. The immigrant child who speaks 3 languages fluently but gets placed in ESL classes. The brown kid who sees the solution but has learned that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. It's about how even well-meaning people, even people who think they value merit and talent, carry biases so deep they don't recognize genius sitting right in front of them if it comes in an unexpected package. It's about the weight that children of color carry. The pressure to be perfect because you're representing not just yourself, but everyone who looks like you. The impossible choice between invisibility that protects you and visibility that exposes you to judgment. It's about parents like Carmen who have to teach their children how to navigate a world that will demand more from them and give less in return, who have to balance encouraging their children's talents with protecting them from the costs of being excellent while black or brown in spaces designed for others. And it's about the small moments of recognition, when someone sees you and really sees you, and reminds you that your voice matters even when the world suggests it. DOS and single quotes. Maria spoke up that day not because she was brave, though she was. She spoke up because the injustice of watching her mother struggle, of watching people fail when she could help, became more unbearable than the risk of speaking. And in the end, that's what courage often looks like for people pushed to the margins. Not the absence of fear, but the math that says the cost of silence has finally exceeded the cost of speech. The story ends with Maria paying it forward, seeing another child in the same position she once occupied, and refusing to let that child believe his intelligence is a burden to carry quietly, because that's how change really happens. Not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in small acts of recognition, in seeing people who've been taught to be invisible, in making space for voices that have been told to stay quiet, in building systems that find talent in places we've been trained not to look. That's the point. That's always been the point. And until we learn it, we'll keep filling rooms with expensive professionals who miss the obvious while a brilliant child sits in the corner, waiting to be seen.